The king of rock and roll. If I were to ask you who the king of rock and roll is, would you know the answer? I'm sure that your parents would know that the king of rock and roll is no other than Elvis Presley. I'm also willing to bet that all of you have heard the two songs, Jailhouse Rock and Hound Dog. I actually found quite the love for these two songs, which led me down a rabbit hole of trying to figure out who the man was that wrote them. I watched many documentaries and read lots of articles, and I came to the conclusion that rock and roll music would not be what it is today if it wasn't for Elvis Presley. In order to help you appreciate this man the same way that I do, I'm going to share with you Elvis Presley's early years, his career, and death. But before I can begin to tell you all the cool stories of his career, I must tell you how Elvis Presley even came to be. Elvis Presley was born on January 8, 1935 in Tupelo, Mississippi. He was born in the middle of the Great Depression, if you can tell by the date, so his family was very poor. They had little to no money. His mother's name was Gladys, and his father's name was Vernon, and they were still a happy family, but they just didn't have any money. Elvis actually was supposed to have a twin brother, but he didn't survive birth, and so that was really hard on his mom, and then later in Elvis's life, it would affect him as well. Vernon, Elvis's father, actually ended up going to jail when Elvis was just 3 and a half because he was altering a $4 check, which tells you how little money they had. According to Christine Wilson, though, in her article, Elvis Presley, The Early Years, Elvis was an ambitious and musical man as soon as he was old enough to walk and talk. When his father was in jail, Elvis and his mother were by themselves, and the one constant in their life was that they attended church every Sunday. Elvis really liked going to church because he loved the music there. And his mom kind of started picking up that Elvis had this huge love for music. And so on his 12th birthday, she gave him a guitar. And this was like, she might as well gave him the moon. He loved this guitar. He took it to school. He took it to lunch. He took it with him everywhere. Some of his friends would even give him a hard time about it. He began taking guitar lessons when he started elementary school. And the teacher noticed that he was really good at playing guitar, like oddly good. So she entered him into a talent show where he ended up getting 5th place. And that was a really big deal for him. He never won anything before. He didn't play sports. So he was very excited. But after this, his family decided to pack up and they moved to Memphis. And this is kind of where his career began taking off. So now that I've kind of told you about Elvis's early life and how he came to be, I can begin to tell you about his incredible career. So when Elvis got to Memphis, he met a man named Sam Phillips. And Sam Phillips was the owner of Sun Records, that was like a music recording company. And he decided to bring Elvis in to his studio, and they started working. And this is kind of the man, Sam Phillips is kind of the man that molded Elvis into who he would become. But the first session at Sun Records didn't go very well. Elvis was nervous. He didn't sound as good as Sam Phillips was expecting him to sound. So it was kind of a tragedy, but he ended up getting invited back to come back and record again. And this session made all the listeners go crazy. Elvis was only 19 at this time, so he was still very young, but everyone loved him. So he had met this guitarist and a man who played the bass at Sun Records, and they kind of put together a little band. And this group decided to perform for the first time on Louisiana Hayride, which was like kind of a big deal. It was a Saturday Night Live show. And this everyone loved him. Everyone loved Elvis. They loved his dancing. They loved the sound that came out of his mouth. They loved his guitar skills. He was just a people person. Everyone just loved Elvis. They all wanted to be Elvis. So this next year after he performed on Louisiana Hayride, he went on to sign a contract for $40,000, which to him might as well have been billions because he's never seen money like that. But then he even went on to perform many television shows, so music wasn't his only journey. He even did television shows. According to Hope Davis in her article, The Life and Music of Elvis Presley, she stated that not only was Elvis Presley at the top of the charts for his music, but he also starred in 30 movies within an 8-year period, which that's crazy. He went on to sell more than 500 million records, which my mind cannot even comprehend that number. And he eventually purchased his own home, which is Graceland. I think there's a picture of it here in Memphis. And it wasn't just for him. He bought it for his parents and friends, and he loved it. It was his prized possession. He purchased Graceland, where he would live until he died, but then he got called to the Army in 1957. And he only was there for 2 years, but he kind of had to put his music and acting to the side, of course, because he was going to the Army. But he was only there for 2 years, and then he came back, hopped right back into it, and he began making music again. He did end up getting married, and he even had a little girl, but his marriage didn't last very long. He ended up getting a divorce, and he even lost custody of his little girl. He began struggling with some personal issues that are never really described in articles, and he even had a really bad issue with prescription drug addiction. So this whole drug addiction thing kind of sent Elvis's career down a downward slide. After his divorce, he spent the next few years struggling with drugs and weight loss and just a bunch of different things, which we see now is more common with actors and musicians. But his family started to fall apart, and he kind of just separated himself from the outside world. He was still producing music, but it just didn't sound the same, and he just wasn't the Elvis that people remembered him as. Despite all of this, though, he was still planning to go on tour, which he hadn't been in a while, so everyone was excited, but he never got to go on this tour. In August of 1977, when Elvis was just 42 years old, he was found dead in his Graceland home, and people believed that he had had a heart attack. But according to Gina DeMuro in her article, Inside the True Story of the King of Rock and Roll's Death, when Elvis died, the world mourned, but a host of mysteries remained. So people kind of started questioning, like, did Elvis really have a heart attack, or was all this because of his drug problem, and people just his family didn't want them to know that. And so there's kind of been some conspiracies about what really happened to Elvis. But despite the cause, it's very clear and obvious that Elvis changed music for every artist today in just a short time. And so now that you know the story of how Elvis Presley came to be, his career, and how we lost him, I hope that you have a greater appreciation for the rock and roll legend. Now, the next time someone asks you who the King of Rock and Roll is, you will know that the answer is no other than Elvis Presley.